As we take a look at our readings today from Mark and from James, we see the words, or perhaps more specifically, speech, as the focus. Mark writes about what questions Jesus had for his followers and the people who at least knew of them. James, like Jesus from last week talking to the Pharisees with their washing and things, is concerned about the words that come out of our mouths. We'll start with James and explore some of his warnings about what we say and how we say it. Then we're going to move on into more detail about what Jesus was asking in the gospel lesson. So, as Ron told us earlier, that most of the letters in the New Testament are written to specific groups, as Paul writes to different places. Now, James is written not to any particular community per se, as far as we know. It's written to a general audience. As we dig in to James's letter, we're going to see that these are bigger situations. Situations that may not be only to a given church, but ones that we're going to see today. When James addresses a problem, he's addressing a big problem. It's a wide problem, but it's still a serious problem. Today, we're talking about James's message about words, about the tongue, and how the words that come out of our mouths are more serious than we think. And today, it's even more extreme. Because today, the words just don't come out of our mouth, they come out of our fingers into keyboards, they come out of our written correspondence, and they last for a long time, and probably even more dangerous. They're fast. They're fast. So what James is telling us about this with his metaphors in the ancient world, well, they're still pretty powerful today. He says that the tongue, although small, it's the thing that shapes words, it's very powerful. You see, James is saying quite the opposite of that favorite nursery rhyme that we all learned as kids. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. James does acknowledge that the person hearing the words can be the object of these untrue words, is the victim and is hurt. But I think James's primary concern is not on the one who is hurt by the words, but the one who uses the words either intentionally or unintentionally to cause the pain. You see, James doesn't seem to be overly concerned with intent. He doesn't say, oh, yeah, you said something that hurt someone. Well, if you didn't mean it, it's okay. That is not spoken by James. He tells us to be cautious in what we say. And there's some similarities here with what James is telling us about words and what he told us last week about being slow to anger. James seems to acknowledge that it's difficult to control our tongue. It's difficult to control our words. If we don't control the words, well, the boat goes off course. If we don't control our words, that tiny little ember of fire, well, it becomes a big forest fire. These are powerful metaphors for the power of words. Now, what are we to make about James's warnings? Well, one obvious place we can go is over to the Ten Commandments. You see, there is a commandment about lying. It tells us not to do it. More specifically, it says, you shall not commit false witness. The instructions given by God through Moses says, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Sure, yeah, tells us not to lie. That's kind of the base interpretation. But we turn to Luther, he gives us a little bit more, a little bit deeper meaning. Luther tells us that we must put the best construction that we can when speaking of others, and interpret what they say in the best possible light. Wow. A little difficult to do. A little difficult to do. Part of not bearing false witness and viewing the words of others in the possible light requires us sometimes to pause, to listen more deeply, to think before we engage in using the mouth or the fingers and the keyboard. Pausing, slowing down. So, I'm going to provide a bit of an extreme example, okay? Real example, and it's something that annoys me a lot for some reason. So, if it doesn't annoy you, maybe it's not so bad. But there are Facebook groups, so this is a Facebook example, so if you're not on Facebook, just imagine with me, that proclaim that they are satire, meaning the things that they post are all false. They're not true. Okay? Now, these Facebook groups are making up postings meant to stoke feelings or fear from people. I don't know. Okay? But here's an example of one. They often have this thing that involves an NFL football coach. Sometimes it's usually Mike Tomlin or Andy Reid for some reason. I don't know why, but it is. And then they say that, Mike Tomlin or Andy Reid has benched or cut players that have done this protest or have joined with this group. Okay? Now, it's entirely false. If you click on the group, it says all of this is satire. If you think about it for a few minutes, you'd realize that, hey, this probably isn't true because it's A, not football season. B, the players' union would never let them get away with this. C, you do a small Google search and you can see nothing about it. So a few seconds of some thought, some pausing, you will realize that this is not true and probably just a waste of your time. But if you look at the comments, there's thousands of people that saying, yes, way to go, Coach Reid or Coach Tomlin. We love what you're doing. Even though there's no truth in it at all. Zero truth. And I think that's one of the dangers that we have as human beings is we so want to be validated by what we think, whether it's true or not. We so want that validation. And if we respond quickly to some of these things that are suspect at best, that fire of the tongue starts, and it catches other people who also want to validate, and then we end up with things that are really strange and not true. Now, for those that were here last week, think back to the exercise I asked you to do. I asked you to imagine that you were a first century Jew and you were listening to Jesus. And last week we talked about the situation where Jesus was in the Decapolis and he was being requested by a Syrophoenician woman to heal her daughter. And Jesus said to the woman at the time, it is not right to take from the children of Israel and give it to a dog. Now, I asked you to stop and hold at that moment. Because if you were a first century Jew who grew up in a certain way, you would have said, yes, that's exactly what you should tell this woman. That's exactly what you should tell her, Jesus, because they are not part of the chosen ones. But if you paused there and you waited to hear what happened next, when the woman responded in a way that you didn't expect, and then Jesus continued to respond, then you would know a bigger truth, the real truth, the truth of God's love and grace that is poured out to people. But you had to wait. You had to wait. So, speaking of Jesus, let's turn to our reading from Mark. So, we first learn in our reading that Jesus is traveled with the disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Okay. Mark, like any good storyteller, wants to set some place, wants to tell you where we're at. He lets us know that they're in Caesarea Philippi. But that may not be all that's going on with this sentence. I think there's some more than just setting a place. You see, Mark does not tell which village they're in or near, which he sometimes does. He could have done that or written something like it was between village so-and-so and village this or that. No, Mark doesn't even name a village, but rather he names a region. Geographically, this would be saying like, oh, Jesus was in Hood County when he was in Tolar or Crescent. It's a more general area. Okay? You see, Caesarea Philippi is named after two kings. It's named after King Philip, Herod Philip. Now, I know you're thinking, another Herod? Yeah, they're all over the place. Okay? So it was named after this Herod, the actual father of Herod the Great. But Herod Philip, he wanted to make sure that the name stuck, so he added Caesar on the front of it. So a little shout out to the Romans, got some help in getting this city, this region named. So Mark tells us that they're in a place that's named after big-time earthly kings. Ooh. And then Jesus is asking his disciples in this region, hey, who do they say I am? And they answer with some pretty good answers. They say, well, some people say it's John the Baptist. Well, John the Baptist had some fame, was doing some good things. Elijah is, according to prophecy, is going to come back. But then Jesus asks, okay, good. But who do you say I am? So, and he asked that of the disciples. So, this should come to no surprise to anyone who's read the Bible. Who answers? Peter. Peter answers. And Peter answers with, you are the Messiah. Okay? Now, Jesus does not respond with, good answer. In fact, for that answer, you're all getting an A for today, take the afternoon off. That's not how he answers. That's not how he answers. He answers in a very curious and interesting way. He says, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. He doesn't say they're wrong. In fact, he tells them they're right, but he says, don't tell anyone. Now, why would Jesus tell the disciples not to tell anyone? Well, there's a couple possibilities. Okay? One of them is we're getting to the place where Jesus is going to be crucified. And the forces are starting to come together to engage in this situation to want to try Jesus and get rid of him. And maybe if the idea that he is the Messiah starts to get more heard by people, this would move along a little more quickly than it's supposed to. Okay? Also, we have to think about what this term Messiah means to the first century Jewish people. So Messiah, which we translate into the Latin language and in turn into English, is Christ. It literally means the anointed one. Okay? So, think of it as the chosen one. So what was this anointed, this chosen one supposed to do? This anointed and chosen one was supposed to provide salvation for the Jewish people. Salvation. Now, as a first century Jewish person, if you heard about that someone's going to provide salvation, they were going to be the new king, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to get rid of the Romans. that's what they're going to do. So, disciples have this in mind. Jesus, as soon as they get the right answer, tells them not to tell anybody, and then he goes to tell them what's going to happen. That he is going to be arrested, he's going to be tried, he's going to be executed, and on the third day he's going to rise again. Now, the disciples are probably really confused. They're probably very dismayed. And once again, who's the first one that says something? It's Peter. Peter's like, oh, Jesus, let me take you aside. This is not how this works. And that's what Peter was thinking. It's like, if you're the king, you're the Messiah, you don't get killed. We can't have this happen. And Jesus, because maybe time's of the essence, or maybe Peter's emotions are getting a little away from him at this point in time, does not explain things to Peter. Jesus tells Peter, this is not what's going to happen. And Jesus rebukes Peter and tells him to get behind him. It points to the rest of the disciples. And he calls them Satan. He calls them the accuser. He's not doing what God wants. Now, what position does Jesus tell Peter to now go in? Going back to following. Going back to following. You see, even though Peter said correctly who Jesus was, he didn't have the full story. He didn't have the full picture. And Jesus helped him see the full picture. And the only way Peter could see the full picture, the only way the disciples could see the full picture of Jesus, the only way that we can see the full picture of Jesus is to follow him. That is the only way. Because if you ask us today, who is Jesus, we can list off many things. We can list off many things. You know, you could go to Revelation and say that Jesus is the one who's going to come back on a big horse and take care of everything and mow people down. You could say that. You could say, no, Jesus has only love, only love. But even if you say Jesus is only love, which Jesus is all love, it ignores the justice that Jesus is providing as well. You see, when we ask who Jesus is, this is not a simple question. This is a question that we need to continue to work toward and answer by following Jesus, by taking time to know who Jesus is, to have that, what we call a relationship with Jesus, but also to internalize Jesus' teaching, Jesus' grace, Jesus' love, Jesus' justice as well. When we're asked who Jesus is, maybe words aren't enough. Maybe it's our actions of following that speak louder than they do.